Hello, and welcome to Yogahub podcast, where we bring you conversations with some of the world's leading yoga and movement educators. In this episode, I'm talking to Rebecca Hanna. Rebecca is a yoga teacher based in London with a very eclectic background that takes in theatre, clowning, contortionism, massage, as well as traditional approaches to yoga. This has led to her developing the art of flexibility, which aims to bridge the gap between strength and flexibility to help people develop their physical capabilities. We're delighted to be hosting Rebecca at Yogahub Camden Street the first weekend of March. She's going to be offering a series of workshops, the first of which is on Friday the 1st, and it's her Thai Flow workshop, which combines fluid movement with self-massage and myofascial release. On Saturday, she's hosting the Art of Backbending to help you get a little bit more efficient in developing the strength required for these tricky postures. And on Sunday, she's hosting the Art of Adjustments to help you gain a little bit more confidence and a little bit more skill in offering physical assists. We're super excited to be having Rebecca, and you can find out more information on all of these workshops at theyogahub.ie. I really enjoyed having this chat with her. I hope you enjoy listening to it. And thank you very much for tuning in. Okay, cool. So, Rebecca, first of all, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to have this conversation. First and foremost, how are you today?
I'm feeling great. I've just got back from Finland, which was super fun. So I'm feeling refreshed and ready to go for the month ahead. How about you?
Awesome. Your trip to Finland, I was kind of having a little eye on Instagram and seeing your updates you were putting up. It looked amazing. I've never been to that part of the world, but it looks like a really special country. I've actually heard from people that Finnish people and Irish people are very similar in temperament. So I'll have to get up there someday. But yeah, I'm doing really well. We just had a bank holiday weekend here in Ireland, so had an extra day off to chill with family and friends. So feeling good, feeling refreshed and excited for the slightly shorter week ahead. So first of all, for anybody listening who maybe is not super familiar with you and your teachings at this moment in time, I thought it'd be nice to begin by just getting you to give us a small little bit of background on your history, your journey with yoga, and how it's brought you to where you are today.
Okay, sure. So I grew up in Yorkshire. I'm a Yorkshire girl. I've also been told that Yorkshire people and Irish people are quite similar in temperament. So I'm very excited to be doing this. But I come from a family of teachers. So my grandparents were teachers. My granddad was a headmaster. My grandma and mum were special needs teachers. My sister's a special needs teacher. So I was always from the teaching world, and it's always been a big part of my life. The direction I initially took it was through the theatre. I was in youth theatre ever since I was young. I then went to study theatre at university, and I started working for a physical theatre company. In particular, I worked a lot with theatre in education. I lived in a city called Coventry, which is, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's quite a deprived area. So I tended to do a lot of theatre in the community, in particular with young offenders, so people who've been kicked out of school. So that was a huge part of my world. I got into yoga through the theatre. So the company that I worked for sent me to do a clowning course in Barcelona. Interesting. But as part of that course, we had to do yoga for the warm-ups in the morning. And I just really loved it because working in a really competitive world, which theatre is, I did suffer in my late teens and my early 20s with panic attacks. And I just found that yoga really helped me to utilize my energy in a positive way, and it helped to calm me down. So because of how it helped me, the direction I initially took it was teaching yoga to special needs and pupil referral, which were the first students that I worked with. So interestingly enough, even though people see me doing crazy stuff now, I did have to work with a lot of people with physical disabilities, so people in wheelchairs, with very restricted movement. So that's very much my background in the world that I came from. And then I went into teaching into studios later on.
I have a very good friend of mine who did a clowning course. I'm going to say last year, maybe the year before. And for something that can sound like silly, because like literally the name is a clowning course.
Exactly.
He said out of all of the things he's done, it was one of the most insightful and interesting things, because there was a lot around emotions, the display of emotions, the communication of emotions. And for a course that you might think is just like joking around and trying to make people laugh, he said it was incredibly deep, and he learned an awful lot.
It's actually had a huge impact on the way that I teach. Clowning is very different from acting. In acting, you are playing a character. When you're clowning, you're being yourself. So you can have people who are amazing actors, but they can't be clowns because they can't be vulnerable. So to me, clowning is very similar to yoga in some respects, because it's about being present and about being with yourself and not hiding away from that. So there's a lot of vulnerability in it. And a lot of that I have, maybe not initially knowing that I was doing it, but I've incorporated it into the way that I teach. Because to me, it's very much about teaching people to be playful, not to be scared to improvise, and not to be scared to be vulnerable in situations. So it was an amazing course, but like you say, it gets a misconception. People are like, you trained as a clown? And I'm like, yeah, but it's not what people think it is.
And it's interesting because when we do our teacher training courses here, you'll often get a lot of people from teaching backgrounds who will be interested in teaching yoga, primary school teachers, secondary school teachers, whatever it might be. And they will often comment on how different teaching yoga is. Like they say, well, I teach it all day. I've no problem speaking in front of people or whatever it might be. But then when it comes to teaching a yoga class, they find themselves getting nervous or overthinking or whatever it is. And I find a big part of that is the certain level of vulnerability that comes from teaching yoga. Because as we're all kind of aware, it's not just a physical practice. We're also communicating things on a slightly more subtle level as well. And I think you can feel like, I guess for a lot of us, the teaching of yoga is a practice that we all love, and we feel that we're sharing something that's almost like a part of ourselves. And the vulnerability that comes with that can be a big hurdle to try and get over at the beginning. So yeah, clowning seems like it was a nice little introduction to that for you.
I think so, definitely. And one thing I've learned with teaching is I think teaching and creativity are two different things. So, for example, you can be an amazing teacher, but have no creativity. So, for example, in the yoga world, you might find it very easy to learn a set sequence and teach a set sequence. But if you were to come up with your own stuff, it could completely throw you and you wouldn't know what to do. But it can work the other way around, because you could be an amazing creator. And I've seen people who create amazing systems, but they're not the best people to teach it. Often their assistants are better teachers than they are. So I think they are two separate skills. I think it is possible to have both, but you have to kind of treat them as two different skills and exercise them in different ways. But I do feel like maybe for teachers in some respects, that idea of improvising and creating rather than following a set structure, which you do a lot in teaching in schools, can make you feel very vulnerable, because you're having to learn to respond to something that's directly in front of you rather than planning it.
So you kind of get introduced to yoga through theatre. I was just curious as to, was it traditional styles of yoga? Because I know a lot of people through theatre maybe practice things like the Alexander technique, or slightly, let's say, like yoga inspired practices rather than in traditional yoga itself. Was that the case for you?
Weirdly, it wasn't. The first style of yoga that I did was Ashtanga, which is so strange looking back at it, because I do not practice it anymore because it just doesn't serve me anymore. But maybe at that period in my life, I needed something that was more structured and repetitive and grounding. But yeah, Ashtanga was the first teacher training that I did. It was my starting point and I loved it for a really long time. But as a person, part of what defines me is my creativity. So Ashtanga for me is too restrictive.
I was kind of similar. Ashtanga was one of the first. I kind of started with, I guess, kind of vinyasa style yoga. But then when I went through my teacher training was very much focused on Ashtanga. And it's something which can teach you a lot in terms of like discipline, focus, consistency, all amazing values. But I also think it's at least in the setting I was taught it, a slightly unforgiving practice, which I think you have to be a certain type of person maybe to really continue with that practice, or maybe I was just too soft of a person to continue with it. But I think it's a great introduction to some of the, I guess, principles of practicing yoga, because like most things, discipline, consistency, focus, these are all incredibly valuable traits, I guess, to develop, which as you maybe then expand into more creative or open styles of practicing can still serve you really, really well.
Definitely. I think it was the right way round for me to get into it because it does give you a structure. And I think before you break the rules, you need to understand the rules first. So it's why I think it gave me a good foundation that I then built on and developed from.
I think that's a really nice way to think about it as well. And in terms of breaking the rules or, I guess, developing your own style as a teacher, you're someone who seems to bring in a lot of different influences and a lot of different outlooks on the physical practice. And I know you've trained quite extensively in a lot of different disciplines. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that a little bit, the different types of trainings that you've done and how you've kind of brought them all together into your own approach.
Yes, of course, I'm happy to do that. So I found through repetitively doing Ashtanga, I think part of it is to do with my anatomy because I have a lot of natural internal rotation. I don't externally rotate as well. And I think Ashtanga is very much, there's a lot of external rotation in it. There's a lot of lotus poses, leg behind the head. So I found I was getting sciatica from doing Ashtanga and I was getting issues with my neck, issues with my elbows. So I looked for something really to develop that initially. And it sounds crazy. I got into pole dancing because I thought there's no pull power in yoga. So I'll do something that develops my upper body strength. So I got really into pole dance. Through pole dance, I also got interested in floor work. So I guess it's more like contemporary dance, and it made me think a lot about how well that worked with yoga and how interesting it would be if you used it to focus on the transitions between the poses in yoga. Because what I found, and I guess coming from a director's point of view, is in yoga, there's a lot of emphasis on the poses, but there's not a lot of emphasis on the way you come in and out of things and the story that tells. And I don't think that's just important physically, but I feel like, say, for example, in Ashtanga, it's a very staccato practice. It's like move, move, move. It's very rigid. And I do feel like when you move in a way that's rigid, that impacts your mental state and your mind. Whereas I feel like when you move in a way that has fluidity, it creates more fluidity in your mind. So I became very interested in transitions and the quality of the movement rather than just the poses. Then, though, I got injured doing pole dance. So I was in a show and I tore my calf. And I found out from my physio it was because my hamstrings were overstretched and my calves were overdeveloped, which I guess is quite a common thing in yoga because there's so much passive hamstring stretching. And it got me interested in how I could strengthen my glutes and strengthen my hamstrings. So I got more involved in calisthenics, working at the gym, integrating weights into my practice. And then finally, I think it was about 3 years ago now, my partner suggested that I try contortion. Initially, when I heard the word contortion, I'm like, well, that's just extreme stretching. And like, that was my opinion of it. But I remember doing my first class and being like, wow, you need to be so strong to do this. There is so much glute activation, so much hamstring activation, so much middle back activation. And the more that I started to train and take privates from different teachers in this area, the more I realized it complemented yoga. Because in yoga, a lot of the times there's a lot of passive stretching or passive flexibility, but there's not a lot of active mobility. And it made me more interested in that area and how you can help people come into things safely rather than just rushing through a class and hanging out in their joints. So it's very much influenced the way that I teach now. And I guess a big thing for me is teaching people how to safely increase their range of motion in a way where they're using their strength and not just hanging out in their joints.
Two really interesting things that you were touching upon there. The idea of the styles of sequencing having an influence on state of mind is a really lovely way to frame it, I guess. And I guess, again, as we were sort of saying, with Ashtanga being sort of the discipline and the focus, and that, I guess, represented by the linearity to a certain extent of the sequence, at a certain time in our lives, maybe that is something which can really serve us. But the focus on transitions as being not just about, because I guess for me, sometimes in sequencing, I would think about transitions solely in that physical sense of like, well, how are we going to get from A to B? What's an interesting way to get from A to B? What's a useful way to get from A to B? But to actually conceptualize it on that more subtle plane, I guess, is a really interesting thing.
Yeah, I feel like when you're moving, I mean, there's two things. I do two different types of movements. If I'm working on a skill, I just do drills. And it's very much of this is a practice to, for example, I'm going to work on strengthening my hamstrings and glutes today. And I know what drills I need to do that. So that's very much got a different mindset behind it. But say, for example, and I am a performer, I come from that world. If I want to express myself, I may just put on music and focus on it more being like a dance. And like that for me is when it becomes more meditative, because I feel like if I have, I used that tool a lot over lockdown. Because I mean, lockdown was huge for me because I was living in China. I had to come back to the UK with nothing. So I went through quite an emotional period. And for me, the way that I processed that was through movement. And that's very much when I'll put on music, I'll focus more on transitions, less about poses. And that's just a way of like me wringing out everything that's going on the inside and expressing it through my body and telling the story. So I guess that's where it links back more to my background as a performer and director. So,
if you don't mind me asking, what were you doing living in China?
Okay, so one of my teachers, Duncan Wong, was quite popular in Asia. So he lived in Japan, but he worked a lot in China. I ended up assisting him for 4 years, which took me to Asia, and I became quite popular there by default, and I started getting offered a lot of work there. So eventually I took a job for a big set of studios in Asia called Pure Yoga. I lived in Shanghai for 2 years, and then I lived in Beijing for a year, which took us up to lockdown.
So for someone who, to a certain extent, and obviously I can't speak to, this is going to be a bit of a generalization, but I do feel that more and more often in the yoga world, people will do a training, and from their first training, they'll maybe go on to start teaching, and of course, they'll probably go on to do further trainings. But it seems like you've really kind of served an apprenticeship. 4 years of assisting a teacher is a pretty long time. And I'm sure something you found very beneficial, but it seems to me in this day and age, slightly less traditional route, but also in many ways a more beneficial route to be taking.
I think being an assistant gives you a huge insight. Also, the system that Duncan Wong teaches, so it's a system called yogic arts, that combines, I guess its root was Ashtanga, because Duncan trained with Patafi Joyce. He lived with him for a few years when he was younger. But then his background's also martial arts. So yogic arts combines yoga, Ashtanga with martial arts and with Thai massage, which has a big influence on his adjusting and assisting, which is something I became quite proficient in during my role as being an assistant. But I feel like because yogic arts is more of a movement methodology, it's not a set sequence, it takes a lot longer to understand and process it. Within my role of assisting him, I also started to take more of the lead on trainings. So I would deliver parts of the training for him. And it also has a sister system called Keto Kids Yoga. So I became a lead trainer for the kids system of yoga, and I teach people how to teach yoga to kids as well. So it was very much, it developed as I spent time with them. I guess my role was initially just more assisting, and then it led to me becoming more involved in delivering that program.
Cool. And yeah, again, it kind of seems like a very, I guess, sort of like natural and useful way to, I guess, sharpen your tools as a teacher and to be able to absorb from other experienced teachers as well. To come back to the contortionist, and I guess for me, I would sometimes have the assumption looking at someone doing contortion that it's they have a particular body type, they have hypermobile joints, and so these kind of things just come easy to them. But listening to you speak, I am guessing that wasn't necessarily the case for you, and that through contortion, you actually learned a very efficient approach to developing certain physical skills. Was that the case?
You need a good teacher. There's a lot of people who are good contortion performers, but they're not necessarily good teachers. So some people do just have a lot of natural flexibility. For me, my shoulders are very, very open. That's something that I was born with. It's genetic. I'm very lucky with my shoulders. Other areas of my body I've really had to work on. So, for example, for me, my hips and my hamstrings aren't as naturally flexible. I struggle with external rotation. But one thing I would say that contortion, if you get a very good coach, is good at doing is making you realize what your weaknesses are. Because I didn't realize these things through just doing yoga. Because I feel like in particular in vinyasa, it moves so fastly, you've got time to hide behind the things that you're not so good at. Because everything only lasts for 5 breaths. Whereas in contortion, the difference is you're working on a skill. So you warm up the muscles that need to be warmed up, and then you need to repeat it, refine it. So you can't hide behind it. If you don't have the strength to do something, you can't do it. And I feel like I like that approach because to me, it's more methodological and it makes sense a lot to me. I love vinyasa for a different reason. To me, vinyasa is more meditative. But I don't think it's the best way to learn how to do skills. And you do not have to want to be able to do a skill. It doesn't matter if you don't want to. We do movement for different reasons. It's not the movement aspect of it that makes it yoga. But for example, if your goal is to learn a handstand, vinyasa is not the best way to learn it. You need to do drills and you need to repeat it.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a kind of common enough thing for people who start to teach yoga or even just get into their practice. Like for me personally, when I started teaching, my practice was fine, but I definitely wasn't overly flexible. I wasn't particularly strong. And then as I got interested in things like handstands, etc., realizing that you're more than likely not going to learn how to do a handstand by going to 60-minute vinyasa flow classes that need more specific, targeted kind of training. I actually think for a lot of us, and definitely I would include myself in this, my practice sometimes got too drill orientated, to the point where when I was teaching, the classes maybe started to become less fluid, as I was more interested in, like, this is hip extension, this is what you need to do to extend your hips, and so on and so forth. So do you, I guess, when you teach regular classes, obviously workshops and trainings offer more space to explore things. Do you look, I guess, to try and integrate a little bit of that into your classes, or do you allow your classes to be just movement focused and less about developing specific skills? Or how do you kind of bridge the gap? Because I think it's a bit of a challenge for a lot of teachers of how do you teach a movement based class that contains the, I guess, the fluidity that we were speaking to earlier, but still allows for students to develop certain physical skills.
I agree with you, and I've had the same issues in the past of becoming so drill orientated and technique orientated that it's become less flowy. And to be honest, I wouldn't say vinyasa is my favorite style of teaching. It probably isn't, because out of all the yoga systems, probably my favorite yoga style is Iyengar, because I feel like it's a lot more technique based and it makes a lot more sense to my brain. But when I am teaching vinyasa, I think you can level up or level down based on your audience. So, for example, you can have one flow and you can teach it in numerous different ways. For example, when I teach at Indaba Yoga in London, it's a very creative studio. My students know me very well there. I know I have freedom to go a little bit more wild because I understand my audience. Whereas when I teach at Tri Yoga Chelsea, it's a little bit of a different audience, so I tone it down a lot. So I think it depends on your audience. I think if you're a new teacher teaching in a new studio, it's better to play it safe first. And then you can always start to level up, build based on your audience. For me, when I do vinyasa, I do very much ladder flows. It's my favorite type of sequencing to teach, because what I'll do is add a motif in. Do people get it? If they get it, I'll expand on it the next time we do it. If they don't get it, I'll be like, oh, maybe I should tone this down. So I think, like, with that style of sequencing, it allows you to read your audience and respond accordingly to it.
Yeah, I think it's something that comes with experience, hopefully, but is often one of the big challenges, I guess, as teachers, is teaching to the people that are there, not being too restricted in terms of what you had planned or how you would ideally like the class to go, and to be able to teach the people who have shown up. It's definitely sometimes one of the trickier things. For sure. And the weird thing about like group practices, that you can have 30 different people in a room who've had 30 different days, 30 different weeks, 30 different years, and to try and lead them through something that's going to be useful for as many of them as possible. It's tricky.
And sometimes people aren't ready for things. It's like, I remember once covering a rocket class, and you could tell with a couple of the guys, they were determined to kick up into their handstands, even if they were doing it badly. I mean, the first few times I tried to give them feedback, and then there was this one guy, and I'm like, if someone's not ready to hear something, that's okay. They're not ready to hear something, so just let it go. They're on their own journey. They're doing their own thing. You can only, and I've learned this a lot in teaching, take people to where they're ready to go. And that isn't just on a physical level. It's also on a mental and emotional level. If somebody does not want to receive feedback, there's no point giving them feedback, because maybe they're not there yet. And that's less so with beginners. I've found that's more of an issue with intermediates, or people who call themselves intermediates, but they don't want to have feedback. It's why I think the hardest class to go to is an Iyengar class, because if you go to Iyengar, you get pulled to pieces. You get told, exactly what it is you need to improve on. So I kind of feel like you have to meet people where they're at, and there's no point forcing that. And as a teacher, it's learning to read that, not personalize that, Do you know, it's nothing to do with you. Sometimes you're just not the right match for that person, and that's okay. I'm a big believer in your vibe attracts your tribe. It's important to be honest and authentic to who you are. And one thing I've learned, especially since I got back from China, is I know what my niche is. I developed the art of flexibility as my niche in London. Um, I've got to a point where I repeat my message. I'm consistent with repeating my message, and the people who love me, and they come back to me on a regular basis. And the people who it's not for will go to someone else, and that's okay. Not everybody has to like me, but as long as I teach what I believe in, what I know works, and what I practice. So for me to teach Ashtanga now wouldn't be honest, because I've not practiced it in years. So I just think it's learning to be authentic to who you are and accept that not everyone's going to like you, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you're bad. It just means you're not that person's cup of tea.
I think it's such an important message, and again, particularly for like newer teachers.
Yeah.
And you can't be all things to all people. And I know from experience, I think it's way better to teach 2 people something that you care about than to teach a room full of 30 people something that, like, actually I'm not really like, not really into this. Obviously sometimes you have to like pay the bills and stuff, but so I wanted to ask you about your art of flexibility courses and your trainings, because I think to a certain extent, is again a bit of a generalization, but what I've seen over my kind of time of being in the yoga teaching community or whatever, that in some ways flexibility has almost become like a bit of a dirty word. It feels like for the last kind of like 5 years or so, most people, not everybody, but there's been a big focus on mobility and strength, and flexibility is almost seen as like yoga almost needs to move away from a focus on flexibility. But I also feel like that's slightly starting to turn around, where people are like, oh, hold on, maybe we're kind of being a little bit harsh or too general in terms of like what is flexibility, or how do you become flexible. So I was wondering if you might speak a little bit to your approach to these things, your personal experience with it, and maybe why you think flexibility is still a very important thing to be working on.
I understand those misconceptions, and it's something that I have thrown on me a lot, I guess, in particular on my Instagram, because it is a platform that I do use frequently. I've come across a lot of negativity at times where people are like, you must have been a gymnast, or you must have been a dancer, and this is not yoga. And you do get it thrown at you. You're just someone who's flexible. And I do think a lot of that comes from fear. I remember on a business course that I was doing, I got told that maybe I should show videos of me falling over or of my cellulite and stuff like that to make people feel better. And I did think about it, and that isn't the message I want to put out there to people. I think we should be encouraging one another to celebrate our strengths. And I think if you see someone who's better than you at something, rather than seeing it as a threat, try to see it as an inspiration. Because I think part of where I've got to is because I have that mindset. And I think we need to move away from that and making judgments around that a little bit. When it comes to what flexibility is, it depends on the type of flexibility, of course. Passive stretching constantly, for example, doing a yin class, might not be the best way forward because you're not building strength with that. I think it's about marrying the two, strength and flexibility. It's like, I can do a cobra and touch my feet to my head passively with my arms on the ground, but I can also lift up my arms to do it. So that kind of shows that I have the strength to support doing that movement. What I think we need to look at is the gap between flexibility and strength. So, for example, if you can passively push into a pose, but you cannot stay lifted in that pose using your strength, maybe there's an issue. So I think it's very much having a balance of everything in your practice. Yes, it's not good to be too flexible, but also at the same time, you don't want to just constantly be doing strength work. And with the name, the Art of Flexibility, one of the reasons I created that name is it's not just about being flexible physically, it's about being flexible in your mind. It's about being open-minded, being willing to try different things, understanding that one approach does not fit all. For example, if I was teaching you to do a back bend, I might teach it in a very different way to what I'd teach myself to do a back bend, or one of my female students, because we have anatomical differences. So to me, it's very much about learning to read your own body. If you're a teacher, learning to read other bodies and putting together something that can be flexible, that isn't rigid, because we're different. Not one size suits all. And so to me, flexibility is all encompassing. It isn't just about stretching, it's about being open-minded.
Yeah, it's a really nice way to think about it. And I think for a lot of us, sometimes with I guess things that require a certain level of flexibility, there can often be I don't know, I guess like a very instant judgment where like, I can't do that. Like that's
Yeah, I think
what is going on there? Like I can't, and almost putting it out of our reach before we've even attempted to give it a go. And I think the ability to break things down into little steps and make it seem more accessible can be not just something very enlightening on a physical standpoint, because you obviously learn about things that your body is potentially capable of or how your body works, but also on that like mental plane as well, of being more open to possibilities.
exactly, and letting go of what you think is the best way. For example, if you're someone who's been trying to do the splits for years and you still can't do a front split, and all you're doing is hamstring stretching, maybe you need to look at it in a different way. Maybe it isn't your hamstrings that are the issue. Maybe it's to do with your hip flexors. Maybe you've got an impingement in your hip. Do you know, maybe it's to do with your quads. I think it's very much like learning to let go of what you've been taught and thinking, actually, this is my body. What's going on with it? Where do I feel it when I'm doing something? The number one question I always ask students when I work with them is, where do you feel it? Because where you feel it is where, you know, it is that you're stuck or that you're tight. And that might not be where I feel it, because it can be in different places in different bodies. So to me, it's very much problem solving and trying to find an approach that works for you. Because if you've done the same thing for years and it's not working for you, obviously there's a problem. It's not the right method for you.
And you've taken the art of flexibility around the world for the last little while. I think you were teaching over in Doha not so long ago. And do you find that your, that's the right way to kind of put it, but that this approach to flexibility is adaptable? It doesn't require a specific body type. It doesn't require a specific background. It doesn't.
It's so adaptable. Yeah.
Yeah. Within reason, these can be developed.
Oh, massively. And I always feel like, for me, the more I teach, the more I work with different body types, the more I learn how vast it is and how many different approaches they are. Because it's not just, for example, about being tight or not strong. It's like, for example, other anatomical factors like how tall you are, how long is your femur, how long is your torso, how long are your legs, how long are your arms. And these all impact the way that you move and maybe the approach that you have to have for movement. I think maybe one of the, because I taught in 15 different countries last year, and I feel like maybe one of the misconceptions or fears when I first go into somewhere, and I'm aware of this now, but it builds every time. Like, for example, the first time I taught in Berlin, we only had 8 people, and I taught a training there last year and I had 25. So I think it's like people are maybe sometimes scared that oh, she's really flexible, I'm nowhere near as flexible as her, I'm not going to be able to do it. That isn't, to me, do you know, the point of me going in? I'm not there to show what I can do. It's very much, to me, I'm going in, I'm looking at bodies, I'm helping people to read and understand their bodies and find an approach that works for them. So it's important to have different physicalities in the room, because it's important to demonstrate how not one size fits all, and we need to approach things in different ways for different people. And that's what I love about workshops and trainings. You can show people that no matter what your body type is, there is a way that you can do it. Do you know, it might not, do you know, ever be as deep as someone else, but that doesn't matter. It's very much, it's finding your own method for your own body.
And so another thing that's kind of a very essential part of your teaching, and also essential part of your background and your trainings with massage and your work with Duncan Wong, is assisting and adjustments. And I guess similar to flexibility, assisting and adjustments is something which over the last little while in yoga has maybe fallen in terms of its emphasis. I guess, again, kind of a big generalization, but I think it's not unusual to go to a class now and for there to be no adjustments or no assisting present, and for teachers to have maybe become a little bit more cautious when it comes to this skill of teaching. But it's obviously something that you like to emphasize and that you find important. So yeah, again, I guess if you wouldn't mind speaking to that a little bit.
I totally understand that. I think over COVID in particular, people got very nervous about touching one another. I also think the generation of teachers that trained over COVID maybe didn't learn it. So I do think that's something that's never quite come back since that period. I also think adjusting and assisting can get a bad reputation, because you hear so many stories about students who are pushed into poses by teachers and who get injured. I've had the same happen to me, again, in Ashtanga classes, being pushed into a pose and getting hurt. So I do understand that there's a fear about it. And I do not think that everybody has to adjust. I think if you're a teacher who does not enjoy or does not feel comfortable doing it, don't do it. Because if you don't enjoy something and it doesn't feel natural to you, students will pick up on that and it will feel uncomfortable to them too. But to me, I feel what lacks in the yoga world maybe a little bit is the reasons for adjusting. It's like you see in teacher trainings all the time. Assist someone in downward facing dog. It's the most overused adjustment in the world, I think. And I think it's about learning to read the space and understand, why are you giving the adjustment? Is it necessary? Also, what type of adjustment is it? For example, there's passive adjustments. There's more active adjustments. For example, if I want somebody to come into a cobra and engage their legs more, I might stand with my feet between their ankles and get them to squeeze me in, so they're using their glutes and their hamstrings more. So adjustments don't necessarily need to be passive. There's also resistance adjustments. So for example, if you're in a straddle pose, you might get someone to push into your hand, because you want them to not collapse in the pose. You want them to develop a little more strength. Then there's assisting and adjusting with props, which I do, to me, is a type of assisting and adjusting, because you're using a prop to help you get into the pose, or you're using a prop to help activate your strength. And then there's the style I did a lot with Duncan, which is more therapeutic-based assists, which is where the Thai massage element comes into it. So I think it's trying to develop awareness of how broad assisting and adjusting is. It's not just pulling people into crazy poses. It has to have a purpose. It depends on what your intention behind it is, and it depends on what type of adjustment it is. So I just think that's a bigger conversation that maybe needs developing in the yoga world, because I think people have a very narrow view of it.
When I did my teacher training, I remember being told, like, in a class, you have to adjust. You have to adjust at least everybody once. And if you're not adjusting,
No,
that
you
you're...
don't. Yeah.
And yeah, it kind of creates this idea that, like, I don't know, I guess you get these almost like stock adjustments, like the one in Downward Dog, where even if it makes
Yeah.
absolutely no difference to the person, you're still going
I
to
don't think so.
push their hips back or whatever it might be. And I definitely think it's important for us to, as teachers, evolve away from that a little bit. And I also think maybe in some sense, there's the risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that if people sort of feel like, oh, well, some adjusts aren't necessary, or obviously so many important conversations around consent and, as I said, the intention behind the adjust, that it almost becomes easier to just like not do it. But that there's still a huge amount of value in giving people this physical guidance, and some people really rely on it at the same time.
I think that is, and I think weirdly, I've had, because I do teach an art of adjustments training that I set up within Derby Yoga in London, and I've started traveling with it as well. And I've also had new teachers come to me to ask me to mentor them in adjusting. So they've asked for privates on it, because that similar thing, they don't feel comfortable. They've only ever learnt it for poses like down dog. They don't understand really what it is they're meant to be doing or what the purpose of it is. And again, it isn't necessary. You do not have to do it. And I think there's also another big distinction. Assisting and adjusting in a group class is very different to assisting and adjusting in a private class. If you're teaching a vinyasa class, you might need to be in and out very quickly. And in those situations, it might just come down to the simplest question, which is, when I scan the room, is everyone safe? And initially, that's the first point I'd go to. If there's something happening in the room that isn't safe, then that would be the person that I go over to, and that might be more spotting rather than assisting and adjusting. But then there's private classes, which I guess is what I mainly teach now. I don't do as many studio classes anymore. And in private classes, you can go into a lot more detail with it because you have time, and you need that time really if you are going to get more intricate with adjusting, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's awesome. Rebecca, you're a very interesting person. I must say, you've had a very interesting journey, I guess, to where you've gotten to here, which is taken in a lot of different things. It's been really, really nice chatting to you. But before we wrap things up, I guess the final little thing would be for anybody thinking about coming along to your workshops that we're hosting here at the beginning of March.
Okay.
We have you for 3 workshops. We have your Thai flow workshop, your art of backbending and art of adjusting. If you want to maybe take a few moments just to let people know what they can expect from your time here over with us.
Okay, so my biggest message would be, please do not be scared if you don't think you're flexible enough to do it. The whole point of coming to a workshop is because you want to learn something. If you can do it already, I guess what's the point in doing it? So it's for everyone, and there will be lots of different levels and lots of different options. As a teacher, I'd say I'm someone who's quite technical, and I'm someone who's quite open-minded. So I'm always happy to go in the direction that the group wants to go. I've always seen myself as a little bit of a backwards planner. So my job there is to read the space and to go with what interests the group, what level they're at, and what serves them as people. So yeah, that's my message really. A lot of it will be technique based. We'll work with props quite a lot. We'll work on skills quite a lot. And we'll have a lot of fun, because to me, when you have fun, you're present, you're relaxed. And that, to me, if you want to take it back to what is yoga, it's what yoga's about. It's about finding presence. And for me, the way that I do that is through play. So it will be fun.
Great. We're super excited to have you over. I'm looking forward to hopefully getting to a couple of the workshops myself.
Amazing.
So yeah, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to have this conversation. It was really lovely getting the chance to talk to you and learn a little bit more about you. And we'll be seeing you in person in the next few weeks. But you enjoy the rest of your day. And yeah, thank you again.